Welcome to episode 1 million billion. What? It's 120?
121.
I think you were right the first time.
Yeah. 121. That's called a certain type of number when it does that with the 1 and the 2 and the 1. This is Cookie Pocket. I'm with the usual suspects. Oh, boo. Brought that up.
Yeah.
Christian and Zach.
That's my biggest L. And at this point, literally, that's the one I have the most regrets about. But anyway.
Really? Oh.
Yeah.
And we're learning new things about Christian, and in return, I'm going to provide him with everything I know about the serial killer, even though I don't know anything, because I have almost no evidence. And today, we're talking about the... Go ahead, Zach. Do your line.
The quiet of the cows?
Well, yeah, that, but what, the other part?
The significance of the moth?
No,
we did a lot of
say,
bits.
Say your other line, the non-human one.
What?
The noise you made. The first noise
man.
you made. There we go. It turns out that the lambs are not silent because we're talking about Silence of the Lambs. There's not, as Zach's review did discuss, there's not a whole lot that can be talked about that hasn't already been said, but lo and behold, we are low on funds. I only have $2 in my wallet, as you can see. So we're going to squeak out as much non-existent ad revenue out of this episode as possible and talk about it. What did you guys think about Silence of the Lambs?
Perhaps I should dive in here, because this was my first experience with The Silence of the Lambs, and I don't know exactly what I was expecting here. I sort of mentioned in passing to my parents that I was watching it for the podcast, and my mom had this ooh reaction, or she like had shivers and was like, this a revolted reaction perhaps. Mm-hmm. But she saw the film and I think respects its quality. The only other time I remember getting that sort of apprehension from them was when we talked about The Exorcist a couple Halloweens ago. Mm-hmm. And so in my head, I kind of thought it would be that sort of horror film where a lot of the scares, while are scary on the surface, exist to make you more uneasy in the long term, the more you think about them. And I think that long-term reality is true here, but this is a lot less of a horror movie than I thought it was going to be, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. I feel like its shape is kind of more of a thriller. I was thoroughly impressed by Jodie Foster, even more than Hopkins, I think. Excuse me, something in my throat, my goodness. Someone put a cocoon in my throat.
Hey, there we go.
I really want to talk about the score at length, because I was moved by that, and everything here feels very intricately designed and professionally made. So much so that it felt very much like a Hollywood movie to me, which oftentimes in this genre might bother me, but here not as much. And I'm not sure why that is. Very early on in the podcast, we talked about The Changeling, which was sort of maybe a rough first step into the horror waters for me. I was very hard on it. And in retrospect, I think I would probably be softer on it now, but I still wonder if my main criticism would remain, which was I remember feeling as though the film sort of reveled in the kills and the death of innocents in a way that sort of rubbed me the wrong way. And there's a lot of content here that could be, I guess, similarly objectionable, but even though those kidnappings and deaths and skin-crawling things are depicted in great realism here, for some reason it never felt like the film was reveling in the fact that those things happened. And I don't really know how to explain that, but it was a feeling I got. I landed on a 4.5. I was very impressed. It's also a film that feels very much like it would be hard to cut anything out. I remember Zach saying at some point, if there's like a scene or some part of the film that isn't doing anything for the film, then it's fat and you should cut it. And this feels very much like a concise and well-edited film. So 4.5, deservedly classic, and daring in ways I didn't expect.
Yeah, I've compared to Christian, I have seen this many times. I've also read the book. I read the book before I'd even seen the movie, because when I was in I think I read the book in 8th grade because around that age, 14, 15, I was getting really interested in horror, but my family was still very strict about MPAA ratings and movies, but I could read whatever I wanted. So I read like tons of Thomas Harris
runs wild.
and Stephen King. I read like Cujo and It when I was like 13 years old. And I read Silence of the Lambs when I was like 15 or so. And then later I saw the movie. And it's a very good movie. It's known as one of those films that it's the rare horror film that's won all the major awards at the Academy Awards that year. And I do think it deserves it. It feels very prestigious. It feels very well thought out, very well shot and filmed. I don't get the impression that it's a Hollywood movie as much. It does feel like a very professional movie. But to me, a Hollywood film is an LA film. And this feels anything but an LA movie. This is the most depressing gray Pittsburgh thing you've ever seen in your life. And it's also, I think it helps to know going in that director Ted Demme was very much kind of working his way up. He started working for Roger Corman, who has a cameo in this film as I think he's the head of the FBI. And then there's a few other independent filmmakers in the film as well. George Romero, who directed Night of the Living Dead, plays a guy with a walkie-talkie at one point. So there's lots of nods to kind of the independent roots of everybody involved, and I appreciate that. I do think it's maybe not as frightening as people describe it being. And I'm not sure why that might be. I think it might kind of just be down to a generational thing, and not in the same way that The Exorcist is, because I think The Exorcist is a victim of its own reputation. And if you go in not expecting like a scary film I'm going to watch with my friends at the sleepover, it is very frightening and upsetting in kind of a soul horror way. It's a shocking movie that affects you on an emotional level. I think The Silence of the Lambs, the frightening aspects of it are more the way that it addresses the idea of serial killers in a way that had maybe not been done as frankly or as realistically on the screen before then. Because now we're in the middle of a true crime serial killer boom. I worked on a true crime show last year, and we did episodes on cases where the person involved hasn't even been sentenced yet. Like there's no sensitivity to this kind of thing anymore. But I think in the 90s, there very much was. And so to see the tactics of a serial killer played out on the big screen like this was probably more shocking than we see it as today. 4 out of 5. I really enjoy it. I recognized I went through that whole description and never mentioned Hannibal once, but I'm sure we'll talk about him later. It's a good movie.
Are these hymns an anagram, perhaps?
It's actually and not Yeah, this is a pretty banger movie, guys. I had actually watched. I'm kind of the opposite of Zach. I'm the beta normie, and he's the Sigma OG committed fan. Right. Zach just did a perfect impersonation of the meme. Yeah, like that. And I watched the show, most of the show before the movie, which is very interesting. And the show is very, very pronounced in kind of making Will Graham sort of similar to Clarice, having kind of the same like intuition, and having Crawford be like constantly poking to get information and have a lead all the time, and not actually being like emotionally invested in the same way. Obviously Will Graham doesn't think about killing people, so that's a different thing. But I think it was very informative and way more easy for me to be invested when I'd seen the show, simply because first of all, the show's really well made, and second of all, it drags out a lot of those similar themes that are projected here. And I think I think I've talked about this with Red Dragon. where it's like the balancing the police procedural stuff with the psychology and the intricately written and acted conversations, especially when they're in close up and everything. Highly dependent on the skills of the actor and the delivery of the lines also, because some of these things written down, like if you just read it versus hearing Anthony Hopkins deliver it, it sounds super cheesy, super dumb. Like, oh, I'm gonna eat people. Oh, you know, make like really dumb. I ate him with fava beans, and it's just like it sounds so ridiculous. But the way he's staring into the camera, and the camera's all the way, his face is taking up the entire screen, and he's like dead staring. Like you see every wrinkle in his face. This is like a perfect 4K movie, by the way. Way up into his face, like dead staring the camera, and it's just that is. A lot of those scenes are what make the film so iconic, and somewhat deservedly so. But I'll also say that the actual investigation, it kind of has a turn, as we'll probably discuss in further detail later. But when there's the classic opening the door gag and it's somewhere else, and that was kind of like the major spin. In the film, and I think that combined with like thinking the FBI knows what's going on, and then Hannibal always being like a million steps ahead, is kind of like the whole idea of every piece of media having to do with Hannibal at all. And Buffalo Bill is no exception to that. It makes you believe in this weird alternate world almost, where it's like it's very believable and realistic to a certain extent, but it's almost like being like psychologically proficient and being majorly self-aware automatically makes you a more intelligent character, one that makes more intelligent decisions. And I think that as a world building concept is very unique and very effective. And that's pretty much what the show does a lot. The show gets more into like the feeling like you're in a fever dream kind of stuff. And other media like Red Dragon does that as well. But talking about the film, obviously, sorry, Zach, for me. But Jodie Foster, I 100% agree with you, Christian. There's a lot more dependency on her to kind of deal with these situations differently and have a progressing dynamic character while also having the camera literally interface all the time. And I think that's super hard to pull off convincingly. And she's they're also carrying the women stereotype, having the Southern drawl thing that Hannibal comes after. There's the whole transvestite or transsexual thing we can talk about. Obviously,
I think we will have to unpack that at least briefly.
So there's a lot going on. It reminds me of like Dirty Harry or like Die Hard. I think might be what Christian might have been thinking of. But in terms of Hollywood stuff, I'm not sure. But it's got like that same kind of 80s, 70s, 80s setup to it, where there's like a million different cops from different agencies like pulling up and like, you know, about to catch them. And it's like they spend a little bit more time going into that. And it's very grounding. And I think it really pairs well with all of the psychological doohickey stuff we know and love from Hopkins and Foster. So yeah, I think it's a masterpiece. I have literally nothing that I would ever change about this film. What do you guys want to talk about? Actually, I'll give Christian the bone. His first time. The score very much sticks out. The score is just, I would say it's just getting close to being overzealous, but never oversteps itself. It really does bring you closer to what's going on. There's some moments where it's like, oh, they could have maybe not done with the score here, or maybe it sounds like, oh, you know, like we're getting too intense, you know. But I really do think it's used just sparingly enough and just in the right moments where even if you don't entirely know what's going on, or like it's your first viewing and you can't capture every single aspect of the story or something, that you really want to know what's going on next. It's very, very encapsulating in that way. But I want to hear your guys' opinions.
Well, I think the score is an element of it never really feels out of place to me, but also I can't think of that many points where it's constantly kind of like memorable to me. There are some key scenes where the score is memorable, but those scenes are just as memorable for their imagery as they are for the score. The score is used to highlight the image. So I think of like when we see the one police officer that Hannibal is strung up in the moth pose on his cage. There's a big moment of score there when they hear that. It might even be in the same. No, it's later when with the ambulance, and we know that Hannibal's escaped, and they hear it over the telephone, and the telephone drops. There's a big score moment there. But those moments, I think, are just as memorable for the blocking and the plot and the cinematography and what is on screen as they are for the score. I think it's an element of the movie displaying its own artifice, because I do think as realistic as this is, or as close to realistic as it is, that may have made it disturbing for our parents' generation. I know all the time when I was a kid, one of my favorite topics of discussion at the restaurant before food arrived was, what's the scariest movie you've ever seen? And my dad always responded, The Silence of the Lambs. The dozens of different times I asked this question, despite already having it answered to me, because he said that it felt like something that could really happen. But, you know, the score and lots of things in the film highlight that this is a movie. This is a story. This isn't reality. I think of like something that really stuck out to me and really sticks out to me all the time now is when Buffalo Bill has his night vision goggles on. We have to see that he has the goggles on. So in shots where he's wearing them, like he's clearly lit in a way that people would be able to see him and he wouldn't need the goggles, which is just kind of one of those frustrating elements of setting things in the dark in movies. You as the viewer have to be able to see things and realize that this is a movie. This is movie darkness. This isn't reality.
It's Blumhouse or A24 world.
What you're saying about the sort of limits or facts of movie making, I think, are what I was trying to get at when I said Hollywoodified, though I think maybe professional is a better descriptor. I was really drawn in by the score. It feels very propulsive, and I'll agree that maybe it's like teetering on the edge of being used too much, but I don't think it got there for me. I should mention that Howard Shore is the composer for this film, and I feel like maybe passively we've sort of culturally accepted Hans Zimmer as the next John Williams, but I think at least in terms of his genre and body of work, that Howard Shore might be a better comparison point, especially in terms of what he did for Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings and Hobbit films. This sort of sense of epic adventure and memorable themes, but this is certainly a different film, and there's a more morose and kind of longer form composition here. There aren't really like Williams-esque leitmotifs here necessarily, but Shore also composed the score for Seven, which is a similar film in more ways than one. And yeah, just very interesting and contemplative. And like Zach laid out, I think sort of harnessed to accentuate the film more than to exist as its own record of music. So maybe in that sense, wallpaper-ish, and not always the sort of score that I'm keen to point out on the podcast, but certainly one I admired here.
There's definitely a reason why on Modern Warfare 3, the remake, there's the original Modern Warfare 2 music, which was composed by Hans Zimmer, which you can buy for like $10 on the Modern Warfare 3 store. Because
my goodness.
It stands very much on its own, and everyone recognizes it. Any gamer recognizes it in like 2 seconds.
DLC's out of control, man.
Brought you guys around on that one. It's not as good as the Snoop Dogg voice lines from Call of Duty Ghosts.
I'm sorry, what?
Regardless, yes, Snoop Dogg. And Arlie Ermy also is another choice. But now you can play as Snoop Dogg and Homelander, etc.
Oh, my goodness.
This is when the train goes off the rails.
I'm very lost right now.
I'm mildly frustrated. So we just talked about Anthony Hopkins.
Yes.
For for Elephant Man, and he definitely plays a little bit of a different character in this movie.
Just a little bit.
I'll say, like, you have like starting out peak potential Anthony Hopkins, and then you have like maximum potential being used in Silence of the Lambs, and then the downfall happens in the Wolfman remake. So I would say that, and Odin also. I'll say that too. We've really went downhill. But I'll say that. Well, actually, I'll let you guys talk about it first. What did you guys think of Anthony Hopkins and I guess any supporting characters that stuck out? I mean, we obviously could talk about Jodie Foster too. Just talk about whatever you want. I don't care.
I mean, I think Anthony Hopkins he's obviously great in this. And I think that it's one of those performances where looking back, it maybe feels less special than it is, because I kind of think that the way that he and Clarice interact in this kind of became the template for every villain hero relationship in like dramatic genre films going forward. I think you can see a ton of the DNA of this performance in the dynamic between the Joker and Batman in The Dark Knight, or the dynamic between the villain and James Bond in what's the one that Javier Bardem is in? Skyfall.
Spectre?
Skyfall, yeah.
Dang it.
That idea of like, I'm sitting here across the table from you or on the other side of this wall, but I'm incredibly frightening in this moment because I have a power. It's intangible, but I have some power in this setting. And I think that's obviously become very influential. I think it's interesting that of all the takes on Hannibal, because there have been a few, this is maybe one of the more kind of fictionalized and pronounced. He does do things that outside of this movie would probably appear kind of silly if they were done by another villain character, and maybe even appear kind of hammy. I think it's interesting that Michael Mann's Manhunter, which came out like a decade earlier than this, I think, which adapts Red Dragon, the first Thomas Harris book. Hannibal in that is played by, help me out here, Mitchell. Played by,
I'm looking it up.
Thank you, Christian. Ryan
Cox.
Yes. He's played, yeah. And that his performance in that movie, I think, is so much more stylized and feels a lot flashier. But his performance, Hannibal feels like a very normal guy. Like, he feels just like a person that has committed these horrible deeds, but at the same time, he's a doctor and he, is capable of having a conversation. And here, that kind of normalcy is played up, where Hannibal is seen as this super genius behind the wall who will outsmart you, Superman. But in Manhunter, he's just a guy, which I think you could argue is possibly scarier in some ways. But it's clear which performance has stood the test of time and is the one that people think of. And in a way, is maybe the role that Hopkins is best known for, arguably. I think a lot of people, when they think of Anthony Hopkins, they think of Hannibal Lecter. And then they go, oh yeah, and then he was in this and that and the other. Especially when he was younger. I think he had an incredible track record. There's a movie called Magic that was directed by Richard Attenborough, starring Anthony Hopkins. And he is really, really good in that. I need to bring that onto the show, because that's like a brilliant Hopkins performance from a much, much earlier time before he was Hannibal Lecter.
Mm-hmm. I think going into this, I expected Hannibal to be, I guess obviously the most memorable and iconic part of this is Hopkins' performance, but I still think I expected him to be more of a main character in the sense of filling the I guess Buffalo Bill role, as well as the role that he does play here. I'm glad you mentioned the Dark Knight comparison before me, Zach, because I was thinking it like, especially during that sequence where he's escaped,
right?
And they're trying to hunt him down, and I didn't want to say it because I didn't want to harm my legitimacy, but now that you said it, I have permission to say it. I also want to say that I very quickly figured out that he was the alive officer. Like in like 5 seconds, I figured out that was him. So, just saying. But
I do think that's some tactful casting, though, because the guy whose face he takes off, I do think that's him lying on the floor in those scenes where they like, oh, it's him, it's Kindry or whatever. So they did a good job casting somebody that he could realistically take his face and people wouldn't be like, well, that's not right.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. I don't know what it is that makes his performance work so well for me, because he's not really going small at all. And the camera's certainly not going small either, as Mitchell's pointed out. I think a lot of it is depends on the sort of foil of Foster's Starling, because she's so, I don't know, I don't want to say down to earth, but her performance feels like it has a level of realism that his obviously doesn't. And it's not just the accent, it's everything. Like she approaches the conversation with an understandable level of fear, but also like determination and some sort of respect, even though she despises him, I think. And that sort of contradiction inherent also in his treatment of her, in that he begins to respect her, and there's also this kind of uncomfortable sexual angle where she's picked out because she's a young woman, and maybe he's more keen to talk to her than to some random male officer. But yeah, everything he does here, both physically and vocally, is so big, and it feels like maybe when he's going bigger with his voice, he tamps down his physical appearance more, like when he's literally just standing there. But it really just works. And I do feel like a lot of our understanding of even like the Joker, as Zach referenced, is super dependent on the iconography and the performative choices made here.
Yeah. Hopkins said that he based a lot of his movements on lizards. And I think you can definitely see that in that sequence where you first see him, where she walks down the hallway and he's just standing there in the middle of his tank as if he knew that she was coming for him. And that definitely does kind of mirror the idea of an animal in its enclosure, just very still looking at whatever it's looking at. I think it's interesting you mentioned the sort of hinted sexual angle, because I think that even though they bring that up, I think the strength of the dynamic between Clarice and Lecter is not that there's like a sexual tension in any direction from either of them, not even from him. I don't even get the impression that he's really leering at her as much as he is fascinated by her. And there's this seeming like he wants to study her, and maybe even like he sees her as some kind of like protege or someone to influence and train and supervise in a way, not in like the art of killing, but just in the art of intellectualism and dealing with people and learning things about people. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic that even Thomas Harris didn't really understand, because in Hannibal and the later books in the series, he kind of goes in a much less interesting direction with that.
Good point.
I even think there's it might be when Julianne Moore played as her, but yes. I think there's like a whole love relationship and everything that happens.
It's worse in the book, man. It's terrible in the book.
Boo.
Gotta take that off my watch list now.
Yeah. I think a lot of it also comes into how Mads Mikkelsen talked about it is probably a similar influence, is that he's kind of a combination of different diseases that serial killers have, because generally, with some exceptions, most serial killers, prominent ones that we know about anyway, are usually only motivated by like one major thing. There's like usually some subtle things in between, but like from a criminology standpoint, they're like basically have like one major motive or something. And the thing with Hannibal is he does have like a tangible end goal of eating them, obviously, but it's kind of like the way he thinks about it and portrays it to people, and has it where only certain types of people that are slightly insane like him will understand. Of course, the show gets into this too, but It's more about like not inviting people to figure him out. It's more just like a display of who he is, like a confidence, like a show-offy type thing, but from a standpoint of being proper and respectful about it, but not to the point where it's like killing them and eating them is respecting them. It's like each individual person has their own like means of respecting them. Like you eat certain body parts to respect them in different ways. And I really love how Hopkins' performance insinuates that he sees that about different people. And he only has a couple, I mean, we're only talking about like a handful of conversations the entire film. Like Christian mentioned, he's not really in the film that much. But when he is in it, he's freaking in it. Like anything he's wearing, the way he's standing, all super majorly iconic just because of how menacing and what you don't know about him is. And I think that level of intricacy that he projects onto his victims is very prominent. And I love how it's hinted at and never really fully displayed. Like obviously if you're watching just this film and don't know anything, the big angel thing seems like a really big thing, right? Well, but he does a whole, like, that's just the tip of the freaking iceberg when it comes to the level of crap that he can do when it comes of like displaying bodies and having imagery and like every single like bone and anatomy and everything. And I think that's what makes him such a compelling character. He has all these different diseases and everything. And I think what's interesting about Jodie Foster is how she's juxtaposed with being simplistic and being frank and having a keen intuition about things more than other people, without it being majorly pronounced that, oh well, she's a woman, so she's a Mary Sue, so she's smarter than everybody else, because it doesn't feel like that at all.
No, yeah.
It genuinely feels like she's more intelligent than everyone else, and it's a very believable thing because Crawford sees her as having massive potential. That's why she ends up being a student, and it also serves doubly as a red herring, as being more of a surprise. So it's just, and her background and everything. It's just like every single, even if the scene isn't serving their performances, it still feels like you're anticipating any number of things that could happen next. Like you're not expecting it to suddenly cut back to Buffalo Bill's place and him doing really weird stuff. and the dog. And
right,
and you're not expecting it to be like, oh, now Jodie Foster is trying to pass the FBI Academy and it's like she's doing random academy things. But it all serves their character dynamics, and I really think ultimately that's what lends so much to their performances, is that they feel like such dynamic characters, and there's a lot told without them really saying anything. Yeah, so I could just go on about that forever. But what did you guys think of, I think it's Rob Levine. I think
Ted
is
Levine,
the actor's
yeah.
name. Ted Levine?
Yeah.
Who's Rob Levine? I feel like
I'm not
that's
sure.
Rob.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ted Levine's character, very, very understated. He only really has his scene towards the end, and he's kind of the major antagonist in this. What do you think of him? What did you think of, man, isn't it suck they say the victim's name like a million times?
Ashley?
The one he's holding captive?
The one in the well, yeah.
Catherine Martin?
Catherine, yes. There was an A in there.
Christian, you're paying attention.
Hey.
All right.
Well, Christian watched
Catherine
this movie
Martin
10 minutes ago.
It's true.
Me too. But, it's fine. 45 minutes ago. Yeah.
Yeah, Ted Levine is really good. And I think he's an actor who consistently doesn't really get his flowers for his performances. But I think you could maybe argue he's more iconic in this than Anthony Hopkins. I don't think in like a forward-facing way, but I think so many people, when you mention Silence of the Lambs, the first thing they say is, it puts the lotion on its skin or else it gets the hose again. I was on set yesterday and my boss did that, like totally randomly. I didn't bring up that
Awesome.
I don't like that.
that I was like doing an episode on it or anything. It's just a client and my boss were talking.
Put the push it on Zach.
one of them brought up Silence of the Lambs, and that was his immediate response. So that character is really iconic, and he gives a great performance, and it feels nuanced, and that character has a whole life. And I mentioned in my Letterboxd review that the production design in this is really great. I think especially in Buffalo Bill's house, because it gives you this presentation of something that Hannibal says, which we might discuss a little bit later, is that this is a person who, due to his own mental illnesses, has kind of been in search of an identity his whole life. And that means that he's gotten involved in a lot of different movements and a lot of different unsavory things. And you see evidence of that throughout his house. There's neo-Nazi posters, but also tons of like American flags everywhere. The upholstery and the clothing and things that are around his basement just really indicates this character that's grasping at straws of something to be, regardless of whether that's a good thing, whether that's a bad thing, just some identity to have. And I think that's really interesting and told as much by Levine as by the sets and the costumes.
Yeah, complete agree. I'm not sure what I have to add to that. That was really good, Zach. Dang.
Thank you.
I think it was just interesting to see again that how Hannibal was not really the threat here, which is what I was expecting. And I guess another kind of comparison point for me is the more recent Batman film, in that I guess the Riddler is kind of both Hannibal and Buffalo Bill. And this is a bit of a reach, but I think that first the abduction scene is really handled great, and the way that the night vision goggles are sort of shown then, and then you know exactly what's happening when Clarice is in his house, and it switches to that view. That's a clever bit of filmmaking. Yeah, it's a great performance. I don't know how much we want to dive into the whole transvestite thing, but it does kind of feel
we
like
might have to talk about that now.
Yeah,
I think it's worth at least bringing up, if only to throw out like a discount or a disclaimer of some kind.
I think the best disclaimer of sorts is what you've already said, Zach, which is that this character is grasping at identities and is desperate to be something. And there's not necessarily, I think Hannibal even mentions at some point that he's not like authentically that diagnosis of transgender.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much that's an excuse or how much it impacts our reading of the situation. It does feel like that one scene where Ted Levine is posing in unsavory manners that we're meant to look at that thing as sort of a not great.
Yeah.
But I don't know what else to say beyond that.
I think I think the best way to sum it up is it's a movie, kind of the way that transgenderism is kind of addressed in this movie is the same way it's kind of hand waved in something like Psycho or in later films like Raising Cain or Dressed to Kill, where the movie does take pains to say this character is not actually transgender or representative of a transgender person. But at the same time, it does establish an image that people are going to think of if they're and potentially associate with transgender people. So it does. It's certainly, I don't think it's actively and intentionally harmful, but I do think you can certainly say that it's unhelpful and unintentionally harmful. And I don't necessarily think that's something the movie can get away from. It's just kind of an aspect of the film. It reminds me of in Bone Tomahawk, there's a character at the beginning of the film, the Native American character at the beginning of the film, that specifically exists to say, and remember, the villains of this movie are not Native Americans. They're these cavemen who live under the ground. But at the point of that character is clearly to go, we're not trying to say anything here, but people who are going to make negative conclusions or make negative associations with Native Americans based on the villains of the film are still going to do that, even if you go, now, wait a minute, don't do that. And so I don't really know if you can get away from that kind of thing. And I think that applies here as well. There's definitely still going to be some kind of harm that takes place, whether or not a sign posted, now don't you think of transgender people, is there or not.
It's definitely a collateral damage type thing where it's clearly an aspect like I think Hannibal's supposed to be Lithuanian, right?
Oh, really?
Yes,
I didn't know
he's
that.
supposed to be Lithuanian. Yeah, he's supposed to be Lithuanian, and if you found out he was Lithuanian, boy, you would have a bad image of Lithuanian people, because how many Lithuanian people do you know, right? It's exactly the same thing.
Comparable, I guess.
It's like if you, it's taking on, I mean, especially in retrospect, talking about the time period.
Sure.
Yes,
Sure.
I mean, it's been like 30 years at this point.
Yeah. And there's way more of a sensitivity about stuff like that now. Still, it was like a rising social issue for sure, like being transvestite, but not representative of the community.
Yeah.
And that's 100% for certain.
I think you can also point to Buffalo Bill being inspired by Ed Gein as well, who was he also inspired like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Ed Gein was a guy in Wisconsin, I think in like the 60s, who killed women and dug up local graves and made like furniture and lampshades out of human skin. And one of the things that he was apparently making was a woman suit out of the skin of these people that he killed and dug up. So I think that's clearly the comp is, this is like Ed Gein, this horrible serial killer who did these horrible things, rather than I'm trying to make an umbrella statement about a whole group of people. And I do think it's just one of those things where lines cross in the case of that comparison. Yeah.
And magnificently freaking acted though. I mean, like, totally convincing crazy person. I think what really defines them as a average person on the street with something slightly wrong with them is when they have casual conversations,
right?
Because it's not that much like in Manhunter. You're kind of already like, this is kind of an alien person that's like not a real person that they're pursuing, and it kind of just feels like it humanizes Hannibal and makes the killer seem like the crazy one. Is kind of the angle that film goes for. And I think in this, kind of just having them be complex characters with very distinct motivations and very distinct leads and things that might not necessarily matter. I mean, he's just like, yeah, he has a moth, like he's into moths and stuff like this, or like the American flag stuff and the Nazi stuff, like you mentioned. Like, it's just like just random cult stuff that he's into. It really isn't like, because that's how it is in real life, you know. I mean, that they're just like random things they're interested in. So yeah, I also want to mention Chilton. I think his name's Anthony Held. He does a fantastic job. I think it's good to have that foundational, like, I'm just in it for XYZ kind of character, with some influence on the plot, and messing everything up. And I think he's a great wrench in the plans, and has his own quirkiness to it, which the show gets into. But yeah, like, even the characters that have really no like psychological background, or have some but like aren't nearly as intelligent as the main characters, or perceivably anyway, have their own distinct like psychological profiles. Like Crawford even gets analyzed a good bit by Hannibal in the film, and they never actually cross paths. So it's kind of just like a different way of looking at things. It adds much more character to the characters, I guess you could say. Who else? I don't know. The cinematography is something we definitely shouldn't go without mentioning, because it's kind of the perspective shots, I think, are one of the main reasons why this film is so memorable, and why a lot of these scenes are so impactful. What did you guys think?
Well, yeah, it's I think the visuals of this movie are, I think there's directors who kind of let their cinematographer do everything in terms of camera, and they're kind of more about the performances, and I generally want to see this. Ted Demme isn't really one of those directors. You can see a Ted Demme movie based on the shots and based on the style. And one of those things in this movie that we mentioned already is when people are having conversations, they stare straight down the camera. And that's an element that Ted Demme carried into later films as well, including Philadelphia. Philadelphia has a lot of shots like that. Very different movie. Philadelphia obviously isn't a horror film. It's not, it's not a horror genre film. It deals with horrific things, obviously, but it still has those shots. It still has that feeling of direct confrontation. It still has kind of that gray mood and look and feel. I wouldn't say that this is a super flashy movie, but I think it's well produced. It's well shot. It's very much competent. It doesn't look scrappy. It looks, I think, for lack of a better word, and certainly not to the extent of like a verite documentary or something, but it looks real. I think when people think of events, they think of them looking something like the way they're portrayed in The Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah, you kind of got at this already, Zach, but I think the way that it depicts the settings with a level of realism and grittiness without sacrificing detail is really commendable, as well as like the darker scenes actually being visible because this is a movie. I feel like it's more of a modern trend now to make dark scenes authentically dark in a way that is kind of ridiculous at some point. Also, just to point out a funny family connection.
You are related to Hannibal Lecter.
No.
The late, great Hannibal Lecter.
Ancestry.com moment.
Oh my God. No, but the director of Beautiful Girls, Ted Demme, is the nephew of the director of Silence of the Lambs, Jonathan Demme.
Yeah.
So there's a familial Cookie Pocket alumnus connection here. I bet you didn't think Beautiful Girls had any blood ties to Silence
I didn't know it was in the same universe. That's crazy.
That is interesting, though, because the setting of Beautiful Girls, you could probably do a real comparison between that and the setting of Silence of the Lambs. The Silence of the Lambs is obviously it at its worst, but Beautiful Girls is, it's the holidays, the kids are coming back home. That's interesting. Yeah, because the house that Clarice goes to of the first victim, I think, where it's right under the train tracks, and I think that feels like it could be right out of Beautiful Girls.
Sure.
It's definitely not in Illinois. Also, why was Crawford in this massive freaking, I think it's like a C-130 plane or something.
Oh, yeah.
From the California Guard coming from Virginia. They're just like, we're just not going to edit that out. How
I
ridiculous.
don't know.
4.5 out of 5. I changed my
mind. There's also one kind of continuity error that bugs me.
I'm ready.
Very early on, Clarice enters an elevator full of men all wearing the same red shirt.
Oh, yeah.
And then she gets out of the elevator in the next shot and it's empty. And I guess in theory, all those guys could have exited on another floor, but it's edited in a way to suggest that that was the one stop. So anyway.
Also a great visual motif, by the way.
Yes.
It definitely introduces her character very well.
That is a good shot. And there's also a great, whenever they're on kind of the FBI Academy grounds, there's lots of scenes that start where you think some kind of a police confrontation is about to begin. Oh my goodness, did they find Buffalo Bill? Oh my goodness, is Clarice on site helping to solve a crime? Oh no, it's a training exercise. And then the scene becomes something else. And they do that kind of bait and switch thing a couple of different times at the Academy.
And having all of her Academy training come into fruition, which they didn't really need to do, because I think it does lend a lot to her character and makes her more of a viable, believable agent. And I think definitely the biggest realism criticism, even though everything else is very much praised by the old intelligence community. The one thing is that she goes off doing this one thing by herself, like going after this massive killer at large by herself as an agent. And in the original script, she wasn't actually supposed to be employed anymore. She was supposed to have been like put on sabbatical or fired or some.
I want your gun. I want your badge and your gun.
Yeah. Badge and your gun right now. Yeah, so it would have been like a civilian investigation. That would have made a lot more sense. But that was a little weird.
She kind of needs to have access to Hannibal like almost all of the time, though. So I feel like what they did here kind of plays better overall anyway.
Well, it was after her visiting him when she got. It was after she had seen him last.
Then it still seems like it gets complicated because she's still not even an Agent yet because they're pulling her from the academy.
Talking to Crawford and stuff, but well, that's all I have for final thoughts. Oh, I guess I'll say it's awesome. Definitely way more of a thriller, like Christian said. It's not really a horror film, although it has very horrific scenes in it. We've had a lot of films like that on this podcast before. But it's a fantastic watch. Anybody that's interested in like crime thrillers or something, even if you watch Mindhunter and think you're a genius, you should watch this for sure.
Well, outside of my thinking in hindsight that I might have called Jonathan Demme Ted Demme throughout this entire episode, my apologies, Jonathan.
Sorry, Zach.
I did want to mention that I do think it's interesting how the cannibalism is addressed in this film, because despite it being brought up multiple times, Hannibal never actually eats anybody, which I do think is interesting. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I do think it's interesting. Yes, he chews on the one guard's nose, but you can do that whether or not you have a taste for human flesh once it's been prepared in a certain way. Because I do think that being eaten is like a very primal fear. I think even when you're a kid, you're afraid that the monster under the bed, what is the monster under the bed going to do? The monster under the bed is going to eat me. I think that's...
It's going to make me watch spaghetti Italian crap.
But I think that's... Because even I remember when I was a kid, Hannibal Rising came out, which I don't know if you guys remember that. It's the Hannibal prequel. No. I think it came out in like 2006 or 2007. And there was a bus stop. There was a bus stop near my house that had a poster up for it. And I would pass it every day on my way to school. And I asked my mom one day, who's that guy? Why does he have that mask on? And she said, well, that's from an older movie. He wears that mask because he eats people. And like as a kid, I imagined like he went home and like ate them whole, and that was why he had to wear the mask. But even that, like, that's a silly image, but that was like really frightening to me at the time. And I think it's interesting what like a consistent fear that is. So even if it's like a more distinguished villain, I'm not going to just go chomp and you'll be gone, but I'll prepare a very nice meal from you. The idea of like being consumed by another creature is still something that's very like viscerally frightening.
Especially when he's talking to you for like 20 minutes about how he's going to do it and prepare you. And we can insinuate he must have eaten the people in the ambulance because they're bringing him food and he didn't eat it. He just had a little nibble, snack, appetizer off that guy. So he has to be hungry. We have to infer.
Yeah, I think I would just close with a couple more semi-obvious things about Starling and Hannibal. I think part of what makes Foster's performance so great is not just her intelligence, but the obvious sense that she's worked her butt off for this, for the FBI and for everything. And there's like an unusual amount of telling that works in terms of learning her backstory. And I guess it works because it's kind of Hannibal picking her apart. But we learn like all this whole anecdote about her like trying to run away and trying to save one of the lambs, which is of course the namesake of the film, is all told basically through a Hannibal monologue and a couple cuts back to her. And I feel like that's not usually the way you want to tell that sort of vital character building moment, but I think it works because of the actors. And we're kind of dancing around this, but I think another obvious thing that makes Hannibal and Hopkins' performance so memorable is that he has this level of intellect or almost high society air about him that is juxtaposed so obviously with his terrible evil that makes him compelling.
when Hannibal's talking about the coal miner background and everything, she got a coal miner's burn from the gunpowder.
Oh.
From the gun.
I hadn't thought about that.
Little thing.
Yeah.
Okay, we can review.
Well, I think I'm going to do maybe a first ever on Cookie Pocket and not talk about a book or a movie or an album. I'm going to talk about a trailer and an idea.
Whoa.
Because
huge brand.
Today at Comic-Con, they dropped the newest trailer for the upcoming Doctor Who Christmas special. And they also announced the first Doctor Who spin-off in years called The War Between the Land and the Sea, which is meant to come out next year. This is part of the current Doctor Who big push that they're doing in combination with Disney Plus, where they're really trying to make a name here in America and get new fans here in America because they've sunk a lot of money into this new deal. And if this next series doesn't end up getting the views, who knows what's going to happen. It hasn't been renewed for new series yet after the first one. And watching the trailer and hearing about this idea, I was just struck with a lot of tentativeness because I watched series 14 and I enjoyed bits of it and I disliked other bits of it, but I did come away feeling somewhat cold to this whole new rebrand on Doctor Who. And whereas Doctor Who trailers in the past used to make me really excited for Christmas to see the new special, really excited for the new series, I'm feeling that excitement less and less with new Doctor Who projects, especially related to this new Disney rebrand. There's just a cheerfulness to it and a broad appeal to it that doesn't feel right. Because as was said when Doctor Who was rebooted back in 2005, one of the writers who worked on the original series said, I haven't been asked to come back on board, but if you were to ask me what Doctor Who needs to be to stay true to its roots, it needs to stay cheap and cheerful. It needs to stay kind of optimistic, but it also needs to stay close to that element of not having two pennies to rub together in order to make this show. Because I think that lack of budget, that lack of resource is what fuels so much of the ingenuity that makes Doctor Who what it is and made Doctor Who what it was for over 50 years. And I kind of think that this new rebrand lacks that. They have all the money in the world, but with all that resource, they can't seem to make more out of it. They can't seem to make the ends justify those means. I can think of so many stories that affected me more than this past series. And maybe the second series, maybe the Christmas special will excite me. But watching this trailer where a Silurian wanders in at the end, if you watch Doctor Who and you know what that is, I couldn't help but think of trailers for Marvel projects, trailers for Disney Plus shows, where every new character, every new thing in the trailer seems designed to make people go, oh, that's Uba Gluba. They're going to do an Uba Gluba show.
Howard the Duck Gluba.
And I'm worried that Silurian is set up for the war with the land and the sea. And I see what Disney Plus has done with Star Wars, where everything needs a show. And I think you would, to a certain extent, agree with me on this, Christian, where more does not equal more. And I am worried about perhaps the Homer Simpson makeup shotgun approach being applied to Doctor Who in the future.
I love Uba Gluba. When you were mentioning the Marvel trailer thing, I couldn't help but think of the Deadpool and Wolverine thing of, it's Sabretooth. Yeah. Oh, it's Lady Deadpool, and she's definitely not played by Ryan Reynolds' wife. No.
Yeah. Or Taylor Swift.
Yeah. And I do agree, though I think for maybe slightly different reasons, because I think Star Wars kind of does depend on the budget. And now I feel like every show except maybe Mando has come in slightly under budget. So they come in, if they don't have a more distinct vision, they come in feeling kind of cheap in comparison to the films, which is a separate problem. But there also is just too much, I think. But I'm not talking about Acolyte. I kind of checked out of that. I haven't returned to it since I last discussed it.
Shoot.
But I am going to talk about James Cameron today. I thought about doing this on the last episode, so this is maybe a little over. No, it's exactly 1 week from today, so it's still eligible. I saw The Abyss, and I got the 4K for The Abyss because I heard really good things about it. We're not a physical media podcast, but I do sometimes like pointing out good restorations and good releases, and this was a really good one, especially notable because James Cameron has a pretty bad reputation when it comes to 4K restorations. His Terminator 2 4K is widely regarded as like the worst 4K ever because he used so much digital noise reduction, which is basically scrubbing the image to the point where the faces look waxy and unrealistic.
Not True Lies? That one was really badly received too.
I've heard True Lies was terrible too.
Yeah.
And Aliens supposedly not great either. But I thought The Abyss looked great. Just make sure you have those noise reduction settings turned off on your televisions, loyal listeners. But I don't know what I necessarily expected. I knew that The Abyss was an important stepping stone for computer effects, for visual effects. And but sort of like 40 minutes or so into the film, I forgot that there was any sort of like whimsical, fantastical, or science fiction element to it. And I was so drawn in by this level of peril that is, of course, provoked by the water, as James Cameron is iconic for now between this and Titanic and The Way of the Water. But I thought maybe even more than in Titanic, just the scenes of water just like rushing into these rigs that these people are on is super cinematic, and every shot and every camera movement feels like motivated and distinct in a way that even quote unquote good movies of the past 20 years, it doesn't always feel like those decisions are made with this level of specificity and vision. And I just really appreciated that. I thought Ed Harris was awesome. I thought the score by Alan Silvestri was very cinematic and appropriate. And it was great. I really loved it. I watched the theatrical cut, which I guess is about 2.5 hours. But this release came with the special edition, which is almost 3 hours. I'm a little scared to see what changes might be there. But I was very moved. I gave it a 4. It's got some Close Encounters to it, some Titanic to it, but it's definitely kind of a vintage-ish Cameron firing on all cylinders. So a very strong 4 for me.
I'm thinking about what you might have missed, because I haven't seen The Abyss, but I do know, I'm not sure if it's the theatrical or some other version that has like a totally different ending.
Yeah, I think the special edition has more exposition and a completely different ending, but I don't know how it's different. So maybe on a rewatch I'll find out.
I haven't seen anything recently. At least so I thought.
Love Island Season 3.
No, I'm not. No. I did hear the season ended. People I didn't like were gone, but there's a cult following around Leah right now. So that's unfortunate. But I'm going to talk about probably the greatest form of animated media to ever grace Cartoon Network, and I think Christian knows what I'm talking about.
No, stop it.
Christian's hype is unfathomable right now. Zach has no idea what's going on, and it's awesome.
I'm guessing it's.
I'm going to talk about what? Go ahead.
I think it's Zach, regular show, right? I watched one episode of regular show with these guys about 5 years ago during COVID. We watched it over a screen sharing service that was really laggy, so I saw like 20% of the episode, and at the end they were like, "Why didn't you like it?"
This is true.
It's a disgrace, Zach. Your internet. It's all your fault. So I'm glad to have seen every few years you watch this. It's like watching a different show. I'm telling you. Okay, it's a different. Capsule. It is a time capsule. I think the season. I think it came out originally in 2010, and then season 4 ended in 2013. I'm pretty sure. So over a decade old.
That's crazy.
We are basically in the grave already. It's what makes it. First of all, the voice acting, obviously. is something it's impossible to overstate how fantastic it is. The depth of the side characters and the number of infinite ideas that you can get out of the cartoon by not retreading old ground, but taking very simple ideas and kind of the teenage to early 20-year like everyday menial annoying things, or like working class job issues, like coming into adult life and trying to have a normal life type things. Also having like potty humor and having like inside jokes with your friends and everything. And that devolving into like a massive like sci-fi 80s-esque sci-fi adventure every single time. The quality of the animation is fantastic. It significantly improves over the course of the whole series and over the course of these 4 seasons. The beginning of season 4 is Exit 9B, which is one of the best episodes ever. And then another one of the best episodes is Stake Me Amadeus, which is the season finale. And it followed, like, Christian's like freaking out right now. I know it's like the emotions are too high. Everybody realizes as they grow up that Mordecai was in the wrong and Rigby's in the right. But it tackles like real life situations that are seriously, completely universally accepted. Like by the time you're in middle school, you'll start to understand like a majority of the things going on. Not to the fullest extent, obviously, but like it's such a relatable show. And people have mentioned like the animation style kind of lends to this too. But it's like they gave I'm trying to think of what the term is. Shoot. I was gonna say something. Oh
Gumball
my god. No. I was gonna. Oh yeah, they gave a druggy show to children successfully.
Right.
And yeah, and there's the music is fantastic. Like almost every single episode has some really iconic tracks.
Yeah, the budget they had for that must have been nuts.
It's unbelievable, and a lot of times it supersedes Adventure Time. And I've seen a good bit of Adventure Time. Not nearly as good of a show or accessible of a show, but yeah, I mean, very clearly you can tell. And also it's influenced, regular shows influenced every other sequential show in Cartoon Network history. Maybe not as of recent, but definitely in later years. Yeah, those first 4 seasons really are like fantastic. I mean, you could pretty much show any episode to anyone and they would find something enjoyable about it.
Except
seriously. Yeah, if we can get Zach to watch 100% of it, we will.
I think it would grow on you, Zach, just for the record.
Yeah, there's episodes dedicated to. You're not allowed to talk. You're not allowed to rebut, Zach. There's side characters that are. Mark Hamill obviously is a magnificent voice actor, but there's whole episodes about side characters, about developing them and having character progression, and that's a very difficult thing to achieve in shows successfully, especially cartoons. It's very hard to have continuity. Because a lot of the shows generally revolve around lack of continuity. Like the way that iCarly started to introduce continuity was very frustrating and dumb because you have all these laugh tracks and you have these very obvious fan-inspired relationships spawning out of nowhere. Dan Schneider controversy aside, but nonetheless, it's regular show is a fantastic show because not only of how accessible it is, because of tackling real life situations and also taking various inspirations from massively iconic works of movies and shows of the 80s. And there's personal touch everywhere when it comes to J.G. Quintel's real life situations. Some episodes are literally adapted directly from scenarios he's had happen to him in real life. So it's a very personal, awesome show. One day I'll review Close Enough. We'll see how that goes. But yeah,
it's different.
Yeah, it's different, but yeah, it's every few years you gotta rewatch the entire series probably. I still have not seen the last season, Christian, and I'm getting there. I'm watching it with Destiny.
I don't blame you. So. I would just say lower your expectations. I don't want to get.
I'm gonna lower my expectations. I've heard things, but yeah. All right. All right, Zach, you think you can get away, but the FBI is 100% not on your trail, and Jodie Foster is knocking down your door, and she's gonna make you cock the hammer back when you don't even need to.
Yes,
it's a double action roll.
I did think of that. Yeah.
All right, Zach.
Are you ready to run down,
night
Zach?
vision goggles on.
From the only good horror movie about a female FBI agent trying to find a serial killer.
You gave it a 3.
I'm just coming for you, Zach. I'm just messing. It was a conditional 3, but anyway, it's time to run, not talk. And 3, 2, Mitchell's starting. Yeah, Mitchell's starting. 2,
FBI force trading.
1. Ah, he's going.
Extra second.
Go,
4 out of 5.
Go.
Baltimore has quite the fun town.
2 out of 5.
Interesting errands.
2 out of 5.
Putting the lotion in the basket.
4 out of 5.
Standing man emoji.
3 out of 5.
Moving furniture.
3 out of 5.
Eye contact.
4 out of 5.
Segues into questionnaires.
4 out of 5.
Leaves and things.
2 out of 5.
Garden variety manic depressives.
3 out of 5.
Looking kind of handicapped.
2 out of 5.
Amicom police facts.
3 out of 5.
Unzipping slowly for dramatic effect.
3 out of 5.
Beetle chess.
4 out of 5.
The president being intensely concerned.
2 out of 5.
Plum Island vacation.
3 out of 5.
Hopkins, University of Minnesota, and Columbus.
4 out of 5.
Disguising as your victim.
2 out of 5.
SWAT stepladder.
4 out of 5.
Goodbye horses.
4 out of 5.
Precious.
3 out of 5.
3 seconds stash.
I did want to
I
mention
glitched.
the rundown has made me think of 2 things I wanted to say about Silence of the Lambs. For one, I did like that they included how he gets Catherine into the van, like carrying a heavy piece of furniture with because that's something that Ted Bundy would actually do. So that feels very true to life. And 2, apparently Buffalo Bill was the biggest inspiration for Chris's voice on Family Guy. So that was something I thought you guys would enjoy.
Seth Green. Let's go. I don't really see the resemblance. That's pretty epic.
Wow. I have nothing to add except that was the most false starty rundown I've ever had.
Well, I think I'm hosting next. So in the interest of ending this episode,
go ahead, Zach.
Next time we are going to be talking about Shallow Grave from, I think, the mid-90s. It's the directorial debut of Danny Boyle, who went on to direct movies like Yesterday and Sunshine and 28 Days Later, and to be attached to a million different James Bond movies that he eventually would not end up directing, but definitely one of Great Britain's treasured filmic artists, and this is where it all started. This is the port he set sail from. So if you're interested in hearing what we have to say about Shallow Grave, tune in next time.
Looking forward to it.
Cookie Pocketeers, Cookie Pocketoids, sayonara.